Tom Moms for America, and I'm here with my friend Christine Seifan. The reason that we wanted to have this conversation is because one of our platforms is to empower parents. And in the last, since school has started, a few parents have said, what can I do? How can I find maybe a good therapist? How can I learn about what's going on with my, especially preteen to like 15-year-old student? How can I help them? And also, I'm concerned about the kind of therapist that I'm going to take my child to. And I would say that's with good reason. So I wanted to bring my friend Christine Seifan-Wolk on, who is a former Antioch professor in mental health, and just have a conversation, answer some of the questions. I do recognize this will be a little bit short today because I need to go and teach directly after. But if you have questions, we'll come back and visit that again. So welcome, Christine. I'm so glad to
Thank you.
chat with you.
Thank you. It's always good to be here with you, Carrie. So hopefully this will be a productive conversation. I have no doubt it will be.
Yes. So I teach in the middle school. Well, I teach in basically every grade world. And one of the things that's come up is these adorable, especially young little girls who are wearing their ears or wearing their tails um, out just in public. And I'm certain that the majority of them aren't caught up in gender confusion at this point.
Hmm.
But I've had some parents and some teachers reach out to me and just say, but isn't this a slippery slope? And I know that you do a lot of work with critical therapy antidote. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, you just want to explain to me where this can lead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, that's middle school, around 12, we'll say, is kind of right around that age where kids are starting to, seek some independence from their parents. They're wanting to kind of start finding their own sense of identity and who they are and their kind of their place in their social circles. Maybe they're feeling awkward and not really able to connect with the friends they had when they were younger. Maybe they're feeling that they're not able to connect with particular groups of kids at school, and they're sort of in this awkward stage. Maybe they're fitting right into, the popular kids groups as well. There could be so many kinds of things going on, and this is kind of a point where they might be exploring some of those things. And that's, of course, where the vulnerability kind of comes into play. And I think it's a point in time where they may be vulnerable to seeking out different messaging or different ways of understanding what might be happening to their bodies or what might be happening to their sense of self or their sense of developing a sense of self. Maybe they haven't really quite developed what that even means yet. So these things can be ways of expression. It can be a sense of expression to wear, the bunny ears or to wear kind of these different, the furry outfits or whatever you call them. And I don't think that that's necessarily problematic. As you said in the beginning, it might just really be about style even and figuring out what I like to wear. I remember back in my day, it was the grunge look that was really a big deal, going thrifting to the thrift shops. And that was something that was pretty, normal or typical of kids to do. And it was okay. I think the slippery slope here, though, where we are today as a society and a community, is that we've got, kind of this grooming culture that likes to snatch these kids up in these vulnerable states, in these vulnerable positions, where a healthy sense of exploring can turn into a groomer's, you know, fantasy, where they're able to grab these kids and start leading them down a path of um, identity formation that becomes negative, that starts to become where it's not just about wearing the furries and the bunny ears and the little outfits, but where actually kids start becoming or identifying themselves as becoming cats or as becoming rabbits or the animals, the furry creature. And there's no separation between this is what I like to wear because this is how I like to present myself to the world. And this is an outfit, how I cover my body and what I show the world, versus this is what I am and who I am. And those are two very different types of things. And I think it's all about language and understanding whether the child knows the difference between a means of self expression and a means of identifying as becoming that. Whereas when the child, and these are stories that I hear all the time, starts requesting a litter box be placed in the house to represent the fact that they are indeed kitties or cats, and they are furry creatures. That's when their antenna starts to go up, because it's not then just about, I like to wear these things to express myself. It becomes, I am starting to identify myself as something that I'm clearly not. And the kid starts slipping out of reality and into a place of fantasy. We understand that at that age, there's still a fantasy world that exists to an extent, and kids live in that fantasy world. They want to be adults. They kind of fantasize about what adulting looks like. They fantasize about what freedom looks like, but that's natural fantasy. That's natural stage development and growth of fantasy. Beyond that is fantasizing as though they are animals and creatures that are outside of what humans are, that they are in fact part animal, outside of the human species, for example. That's when the red flags should go up, and we should understand something more nefarious is at work here. And our kids are a little bit more in danger at that point, and we need to look a little bit further at what's happening. Have they been caught up in some kind of movement here? Are they being caught up in a groomer type situation? So I think the first thing to do is to not panic as parents and not panic as teachers, and not immediately run into, okay, my kid has been completely captured, but to actually have kind of sit down conversations about what your kids know and what your kids don't know, what they understand and don't understand about this new way of dressing or this new way of behaving. And that's the number one thing we need to do, is first start off with that kind of a dialogue.
One of the things that I'm wondering about is the push, because it seems like there's a link between this and then you have to affirm, right? So then when you have to affirm, it's really getting into the conversation about free speech. Because if you have to affirm somebody, you have to make them believe that you're playing along, even if you're not. Um, and if, to me, that can cause harm in its own. It also causes harm to all the people who have to deal with it, especially families
Mm-hmm.
who have to play along, siblings who have to play along with a delusion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what kind of long-term effects can that have on a family?
Well, I think that's where, this idea of free speech, it's not that cut and dry, I don't think.
Okay.
I think that freedom of expression and freedom of, the free speech to express yourself how you want is one thing. I think losing touch with reality is something else. And I think that's the very big distinction. So we can affirm that somebody wants to express themselves in some way, but the problem with affirming that that person has indeed become a cat or has indeed lost touch with reality is something else. That's when free speech becomes not free speech any longer, but an actual, let's say, loss of reality that is that becomes harmful. It becomes harmful to the child and it becomes harmful to the family, where I don't necessarily believe that affirmation is the way to go. Therefore, I think that a conversation has to be had about, look, it's okay to express yourself this way, that you want to dress in these clothes and you want to, you know, express yourself by wearing these things and whatnot. It's also important that you understand the reality that you're a human being, that you're not in fact a cat, and we need to talk about the differences between those things. So talking about yourself as being a cat, that's not the reality of what you really are, and that's the conversation that has to be had. So I think free speech has its limitations in these scenarios. It's not about being able to say, you think of free speech as being able to, say what you think and feel and how you want to express. But kids at age 12 and 13 and 14 and 15, they don't have the sophistication emotionally and mentally to have no guardrails around what that looks like. That's when the adults in the room have to step in with guardrails
Well,
to
and
be
that's
able.
what I'm asking is about the adults in the room, their free speech. When a child comes in and says, I'm now to be known as meow meow, right?
Yes,
And
that's when the
that's,
adult.
but then the adults sometimes have to follow that, depending on what their school or as a therapist, they're if they do like affirmative language,
That's a
um,
problem.
right. Now, and it is a problem, right? I mean, there are
That's a
therapy
problem. Yes,
that there are places that absolutely 100% affirm. I know that because of conversion therapy, the pendulum swung in the other direction all the way to you must affirm.
that's right. So we went from exploratory therapy, which is let's sit and explore the reasons in which you feel this way or the reasons in which you want to be addressed in this fashion. And let's do a little bit of reality testing here. Let's talk about what is based in sound fact and what is based in fantasy. Let's talk about the difference between the two of those things, because the fantasy world colliding with the world of reality is where this sort of, these two things are intersecting here. Let's pull that apart. What's real and what's not? Affirmation is affirming fantasy. And that's where the disconnect has really brought this entire generation into a place that's really dangerous. Exploratory therapy is where we were at one point in the field. That's where we were training our therapists to really spend time exploring the difference between fantasy and reality. Affirmative therapy now has become validation, not just of feelings, but validation of irrational thought. And that's the difference. You can affirm feelings. You can affirm feeling different. You can affirm feeling like you're in a, you don't belong or you're in a different kind of a body. But affirming that that is reality is something different. And that's where those two things cannot coexist and lead us into anywhere good. That's where we're going wrong and failing, is that we're affirming the fantasy. We're not leaving space there to do some exploration which tests the reality of what actually is versus what people are feeling, because feelings don't equate reality. They're two separate things.
So, in terms of therapists that are currently coming out of mental health school or therapy school,
Yes.
what's going on there?
What's going on there is very dangerous. So what's going on there is that therapists are being taught in the spirit of social justice, in the spirit of affirming the lived experience of each person. Therapists are being taught to affirm all of it. So even things that are fantastical, that are fantasy based and driven solely based on that, of wanting to deny reality, therapists are still taught that affirming is what we're supposed to be doing. Validation, validating feelings. They're not taught the difference, or they're not encouraged to practice the difference between validating a feeling of, I feel like I'm uncomfortable in my own skin. Okay, that's great. That's a place to start. Let's explore that. They're not taught that anymore. They're taught that if you feel uncomfortable in your own skin, then maybe you're not in the right skin to begin with. That's the affirmation that's going on. That's where then we're seeing kids who are turning themselves into kitty cats, who are becoming transgender, who are starting to suffer from feelings of gender dysphoria. And I've said many times, I'm not even sure I believe a child that young can suffer from gender dysphoria, because I do not think that they have the cognitive or emotional sophistication to understand what that even means. They are having an experience of being uncomfortable or in some way not feeling as though they belong. But let's look at what's going on there. Affirmative therapy does not look at what's going on there. It looks at how can we get you to feel more comfortable by affirming your feelings and helping you transition into becoming what it is that you want to become, without looking at the reality and the irrationality of those thoughts and ideas. So if
That
I come in, go ahead.
that just it doesn't make sense to me because therapists are supposed to be there to help, and I don't see it. I don't see this as helpful in any way. In,
It is
in
not.
terms of mental health, it seems like it is breaking the problem. Now, I've heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that a lot of therapy has flipped, and the goal is to get those kids in to get them on that social justice. And if a child is not affirmed, they are then told that they are oppressed.
Yes.
And if they're oppressed, and the reason this matters so much to me and why I wanted to do it in such a timely manner is you're aware of what happened in Utah 3 weeks ago.
I sure am.
And that comes from a belief in something so strong that you can't even look at another person's you can't look at another option.
Yes.
And to me, those things seem linked together. Am I wrong about that? Or is that where this leads? Like, is it anything? To me, it's like you're fishing, like somebody, and they actually
Mm-hmm.
use that term. Um, uh, um, the assassin's boyfriend called himself a fisher. He identified as
Mm-hmm.
a fisher.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard that term before?
I have. I
What does it
have.
mean? Can you explain it?
A fisher. So the way that I understand it is, a fisher is somebody that's going to be looking for the vulnerabilities in somebody else, that lead them to be able to kind of groom them in a sense, to be able to bring them, give them the kind of the love bombing and bringing them into sort of the cultish kind of behavior and distance, I guess, from from reality, to continue to affirm, what you know what they want them to be, essentially. So you're not going to go out fishing for somebody that has a pretty clear stance of who they are, and a pretty good stance of reality, and a pretty good sense of their feet planted on the ground. You're going to be fishing for people that are more vulnerable, that perhaps are bullied or perhaps are autistic. That's something that is we've seen a lot of as well. You're going to be fishing for people that maybe are a little bit more emotionally, um, easier to influence, let's say. Those are going to be the targets, for example, the people that aren't as comfortable in their own skin, the people that are looking to belong, the people that are looking to be loved in some way, the people that are looking to fit in. There's a specific target that's in mind when people are out there fishing. They're looking for kind of this hanging fruit, and there's sort of a profile that fits into that.
And so is that profile online? Or I'm just wondering, say you have a carnival or something and you've got these cute little girls in their, oftentimes belly shirts with their little tails hanging out and their ears. Would they become prime targets for fishers, or is it more of an online thing, or is it both? What are
I
they
think
looking
it's
for?
I think it's anywhere they can find them. I think it's things online that these kids say. Social media is full of it's a fisherman or fisher person's dream, social media, because it's a contagion. But I do think that it can be anybody that you see at school. It can be people that are walking around, because those people are expressing a vulnerability to living in the fantasy. They're appearing as though they're living in that same fantasy. And when you can get somebody, and you're fishing, you're the fisherman that's out
Mhm.
there looking, you're looking for somebody to live in the fantasy with you. You're looking for somebody that you can exploit in some way. You're looking for somebody to kind of be a part of this world that you've created or that you're in, whether it's because you want to control, whether it's because you want to further the fantasy yourself, whether it's because you yourself have been harmed in some fashion, whether it's because you yourself actually believe in what you're doing. I mean, there's a number of reasons. So of course, those people that are presenting themselves that way are going to give off an energy that's going to attract people that are going to want to do that. So you are leaving yourself more vulnerable to being brought in to that kind of a world, by what you say online, by the way that you present yourself at school, by the way you present yourself walking around in the world around you, by the groups that you hang out with. Those things are all, fishing is just another word for, grooming in a sense. Groomers are fishers. They're people that are fishermen that are looking to grab whom they find to be vulnerable.
And who are the typical fishers? Is there a typical group of people? Are they trolls online? Are they teachers? Are
They
they
can be any of those people. They can be teachers, they can be trolls online, they can be the adult that goes to work every day at a corporation and has a normal job that looks perfectly harmless, and then has a whole different dual life that they're living. But they typically have kind of catchphrases and ways of being. They sort of, that concept of love bombing, they tend to promise to provide what that person believes they're not getting in other relationships. Nobody understands you like I understand you. Nobody can get the pain that you're suffering the way I can. Nobody understands your sense of self that you're presenting to the world the way I can understand you. They start by promising that they're going to fill in whatever it is that person feels that they're missing, what they're not getting, either from their parents, from their adult relationships, from their school friends, from any other group that they're a part of. Here's the solution. I'm going to help you. I'm going to give that to you. I'm going to be there so that you can get those needs provided for. That's what's very dangerous, because it's not like these are people that are going in there with a very violent, you know, come on board or else kind of a thing. They're
right?
going in there providing love, or what appears to be love. That's the danger. And when your therapist is also doing that for you and providing you with that kind of love and affirmation and understanding you in a way that nobody else does, and affirming, again, your fantasy, or giving you what others aren't giving you, that creates a dynamic where somebody feels more and more pulled toward the groomer or that person who's giving you that love, and pulled away from those other attachments in your life that are, your parents, or that are, other friends. And there's an isolating effect that just results from that kind of pulling, that kind of breaking away from your primary attachments, or the people who are supposed to love you and care about you, who really do care about you. That's what the goal really is. It's really to pull them in so that they have some control.
So how
And
does
it's, go ahead.
I'm sorry, how does a good therapist, we're talking a 19-year-old going off to college, going, I want to be a mental health counselor because there's a mental health crisis and I want to help people heal. How do they, in those few years, change into buying into social justice. And I mean, I'm reading right now something from a Reddit page that says they bought estrogen, but no anti-androgen. And then another person says it would have been more fun if he started hormone blockers at like 12. And then the other person says, haha, isn't that true for everyone? Don't worry, I'll make him into a good little girl.
Mm.
So
That's disgusting. I just have
it
to
is
say, for one,
utterly
absolutely
disgusting.
disgusting.
It is. And I'm trying to read it with as little emotion as possible. But it's right here on my page. The person I want to give
Sure.
credit is his name is Turkey Tom. He
Mm-hmm.
apparently goes into Reddits and reads this stuff that, for me, 30 seconds of is like, oh,
Mm-hmm. Yes,
believe that
it's
people would
pretty
do this.
horrifying. I mean, I think what's happening a couple things at the academic level. First of all, there's selection for social justice warriors, and that happens at the admissions level. So the selection process for bringing people into the programs now, this day and age, and I can speak from experience as an admissions interviewer because I taught, but I was also an admissions interviewer, is that they're selecting for social justice warriors. So they're selecting for in their process people that want to become activists. And part of what they're doing is they're looking at what you've done in your community to become an activist. What have you done? And do you understand the activism model? So that's one, component. And then they bring you in and essentially the courses are set up in such a fashion that every class particularly even classes that are about theory, personality theory, bring in an undertone, some kind of, they're all anchored in diversity. So these words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are part of, they're not just buzzwords that are used in programs that are in, corporations now. They're bringing in diversity experts, whatever they've been doing. Those are the cornerstones of how these programs are now built. So these students are coming in, they're already social justice minded. So they're already ideologically minded. And then the classes are building on top of that. So they're coming in and they're saying this is the best way to help people. So you have people coming in there and saying, oh, well, of course I want to be part of the solution and not the problem. Well, of course I want to help. All of this sounds very important. It sounds important to be diverse, and it sounds important to be equitable, and it sounds important to be inclusive of everybody. And little by little, there's some kind of, I don't, brainwashing might be a strong word, but no, I think it's brainwashing. There's some sort of brainwashing that kind of happens. And I can say that from my own experience teaching, is that if you hear the same message over and over again, class after class after class, you start to adopt it and internalize it. You have people all around you that are talking about these kinds of practices that eventually you start kind of saying it back and you start internalizing it yourself, and it starts to become part of the rhetoric that's infiltrating. And they're structured in such a way that if you stand out by saying, I don't believe in this, or I don't think this is beneficial or therapeutic, you are bullied, you are kicked out of the program, you are told that you are a racist, you are told that you are homophobic, you are told that you are a white supremacist, and you are shamed. So people are silenced. Anybody who steps out of line is silenced. So then the question becomes, do I just drink the Kool-Aid for as long as I can make it through this program and then practice how I want? Or do I drop out? Or do I eventually become one of them? It's one of those three that happen to people. They either leave, they either keep their head down and do the work and just get through it until they can practice how they want, or they become that person. And your boards and your regulating bodies, that regulate your license, have also become captured. So you have a standard of practice once you leave that tells you how you're supposed to be as a therapist and what your ethics board tells you how to practice, people are very afraid to stray outside of that model because they don't want to have complaints against their license. They don't want people to complain and somehow have their licenses suspended or revoked. So it becomes a much bigger issue down the line, trying to practice in any different way. Are all therapists practicing affirmative therapy? No. But is it hard to find one who isn't? Yes. It is very difficult to find one who isn't practicing that way currently. They're out there, but they're hard to find.
So how do you find one, especially in a state that requires affirmative? Or is there another option? Or should, I mean, I've always thought if I were in those places, and I'm so grateful that I'm not. But if I were, I just thought, yeah, we'd get up, we would be at a cabin every single week doing nothing but family time, talking, talking it out, making sure that we were the most important people. And I mean, we already do that in our family, but I would think that in a case like that, I wouldn't want to take the chance.
I think that, it's one of two things. I think if you're going to go into therapy, if you're going to go to a therapist, you need to interview the therapist. The parents, the family have got to interview the therapist. How do you work? How do you practice? What is it that you're going to do for my child? Or how can you help me help my child? How are you going, how do you, what are your standards of practice? What type of therapy do you practice? You have to ask the right questions. Do you practice exploratory therapy? Do you practice affirmative therapy? What kind of therapy do you do? What does that look like in the room? And how do you involve us as parents? Because if they don't involve the parents and they don't involve, and have open dialogue with the parents and work as a team to help this child, then there's a huge problem there. Because what starts to happen then is that the therapist is on the kid's side and it becomes the kids and the therapist against the parents. That's when you start to see the therapist telling the parents, you really need to start affirming your child and your child's fantasies because and lack of their disconnect from reality. Otherwise your child is going to kill themselves or your child is going to become so suicidally depressed, and they're not going to be able to get through this. So you have to make sure that the therapist is willing to bring you on board in some capacity, and that they're willing to do exploratory therapy, and that they're there to bridge the gap that's happened between the child and the family and bring them together as a family rather than separate them. And your job, and if the therapist isn't willing to do that, or the therapist says, I practice affirmative therapy here, and this is all about feeling heard and loved and cared for, that's a very big red flag. Because yes, we want them to feel cared for, and we want them to also understand that feeling uncomfortable in your body is natural and normal. It does not mean you were born in the wrong body. It does not mean you're the wrong sex. It does not mean that you are not a human and you are, in fact, an animal of another species. These things are facts. And if a therapist is unwilling to address the facts with that child, don't go to that therapist. They have to be willing to practice that kind of therapy. If that's not something they can do, you're better off not seeking therapy at all. There's some great books for parents, and these are things that parents can do at home with their kids and conversations they can have at home with their children. You can support your children and be loving and caring and not align or co-sign onto that behavior that they're in fact trans or that they were in fact born in a different body. There's very good reality testing questions. If I decide that I want to identify as being a doctor, does that mean I should go into an operating room and start operating on my patient because I've decided that I identify as a doctor? Well, why not? I mean, these are kinds of questions that are open for conversation that you can have with your children to help them start to see the difference between the fantasy and the reality, the difference between I feel uncomfortable in my body does not mean I am in the wrong body. It is okay to feel uncomfortable. It is okay to hate the changes that I'm going through. It is okay to talk about the struggle and the difficulty with that. It is okay to go through a phase of that and trying to find my way through it. It does not mean that I am in the wrong body. Those two things don't equal, that does not equal, that equation does not equal, therefore I am in the wrong body. And that's where we have the big issue, is that the therapists are saying, yes, that means you're in the wrong body. Parents are saying, gee, I guess you are in the wrong body. Your therapist says so, and you're telling me so. And that's where the big disconnect is. And that's where let's introduce ways in which you'll feel better. Let's have you change genders, change your biological sex.
Okay, so when parents are going through this, I'm just struck by the comment, if you don't, then they will likely remove themselves, right? They'll likely commit suicide. Um, to me, this looks like, I mean, how do you figure out if you're being manipulated or if your child is actually at risk? Which, because I can't imagine living and every day wondering if your child is going to make it through that day or not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'm not going to sit here and say your child is or isn't because I haven't met them and I haven't assessed them. And I can't make that statement. I cannot promise. And that would be irresponsible and irrational for anybody. At that point, you have to have the child professionally assessed on whether or not they actually are in fact suicidal. If they are in fact suicidal, and that is the actual truth, they need to then get appropriate treatment so that they become stabilized. Once their mental health is stabilized and they are no longer suicidal, that's when we can revisit the work of the transgender component. But you can't do that if the child is in fact suicidal.
but
Most
some
of
of
the
these,
time,
go ahead. Yes.
most of the time, that's not going to be the outcome. Most of the time, they aren't actually suicidal. There's something deeper going on for them that is making them very distressed. And this seems like the solution to them is that changing sexes or somehow manipulating that in some way is going to fix the problem. And that's not actually the case. We're sort of jumping to this solution. It's kind of lazy practice in a way to say that this is the answer, and most of the time it's not. So I would say, and this is just ethically as a therapist, we have to assess the actual risk for that, and we have to have them stabilized. Once that part is done, or we've assessed and we realize the risk is not an actual active risk of suicide, then we can start to look at where that came from and start to actually work with the child again, and look at what's happening there and start to look at what the real issues are underneath the surface, because that's all surface stuff. I'm going to kill myself if I can't change my gender. If there's something else going on there are deeper issues that are of serious anguish that this child is suffering from. Let's look at where that anguish is coming from. It's
What I'm
not a matter.
concerned,
Go
what
ahead.
I'm concerned about is that oftentimes, just like in Facebook groups and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
when you try to bring reason into the conversation, oftentimes it is counselors who will say, you need to just affirm. If you don't, you're a high risk of suicide. You could cause real harm to this child. And so if the parent is going, I'm really concerned about my child, and then they're taking them to that therapist, and that therapist is feeding that, because it didn't used to be very normal for children to regularly talk about suicide.
Sure. That's also a contagion, by the way. It's also something that this day and age, and the suicide rate, first of all, social media has increased suicide rates exponentially, and it has a lot to do with the increase in depression, anxiety, the what people see on social media and what these kids are exposed to and the ages that they're exposed to. It's extremely out of control. They have too much access to too many things that they are not equipped to handle, cognitive and emotionally. They're going on to different sites, and there's just a complete overload of stimulation that they're not prepared to manage. So that's already a problem. But my response would be, if you're really worried your child is suicidal, then your child needs to be assessed by a psychiatrist and somebody who can go through and assess them. When your child is stabilized at some point, then you need to find a mental health provider that is going to actually perform, as I mentioned, the kind of therapy that isn't just going to be affirmative. And if your child is stabilized and no longer suicidal, if they actually were suicidal at one point, then this other then you know exploratory type therapy is the type of therapy they need. But the family needs to be involved, the parents need to be involved. It needs to be a family type of involvement where you're working as a team, and you're not working as, you need to help my kid, and I need my kid to just stop feeling this way. This is very difficult stuff, and it's not just going to happen in a therapy room. There's stuff that has to happen at home too, that parents are going to have to be able to deal with at home. They have their child 99% of the time. That child's only with a therapist an hour a week, or a couple hours a week at most. So
Right.
the issue with the suicide is extremely important, and I don't want to downplay how important that is if a
Mhm.
child is saying, I want to kill myself. But that means inpatient, a potential inpatient stay
Mhm.
at an inpatient facility for kids who are acutely suicidal, and getting them to a point where their emotions are regulated and they're stable, and they can actually do the work. And that's the case with adults too. They've got to be emotionally stable and regulated enough to be able to do any kind of deep, meaningful therapeutic work. So while I believe that most of the time that's not going to be the case, you still have to treat suicidal threats seriously anytime they happen. But
I
you don't
just
go back to the same therapist who tells you,
right. Well, and
the
I wonder
kids
if
can.
with that with the clinics too, because unfortunately, it's becoming more and more normalized to spend time in psych wards. And a lot of young people are seeing it as
Mhm,
like a vacation.
they sure are.
And
They are.
I wonder if that makes it worse. And if it does make it worse, what in the world are your options? If if the places that you should be able to go to get the help that you need are just as indoctrinated, what what do you do?
I think what you try to do is you try to get involved before your kid gets to that place. You try to pick up on the warning signs, and you try to pick up on what you're seeing behaviorally with your child. Children leave clues. And I think if you can pick up on those things before it gets to be that dire, like when you start to see your child dressing a little different and doing things a little differently, check in with them. It
Mhm.
doesn't need to be a big red alarm, sirens going off crazy. You don't need to overreact, but
Mhm.
check in with them and find out a little bit about their lives and what's going on. Do a little bit of, investigation. Build the kind of relationship with them so that you're able to have some bit of dialogue. They're not going to tell you everything. That's, of course, normal, right? Because they have some things that they keep to themselves and that they're private about. That's
Mhm.
part of development. But look for those things that seem just a little bit off, and have those conversations before you get to that point to where it's become that extreme, because it doesn't necessarily happen overnight either. It happens with little things. Little by little, you see that these kids are doing something a little different, maybe acting a little different, starting to change their clothes a bit, starting to change their hair a bit. And you want to be able to have those conversations. Get your kids out of the house and off to nature. Go take your kids and do family day. Go take your kids and do, I don't, up in the mountains and go sledding. Go on, go take them boating. if you don't live by a lake, there's maybe some kind of nature, something. Get them away from their phones, get them away from technology for a little while, get them engaged in life outside of technology and outside of the screens, where they can connect and you can connect as a family. They can connect a bit to something outside of their heads, because it's a dangerous place to live, is in that constant, the
Yeah.
screen and in your head. Those two things together all the time are problematic. So get them to go, bike riding. I mean, the days of just riding your bikes and playing outside, something else that keeps them to, limited on that kind of the screen time, the areas that are hotbeds of danger for all of this kind of stuff.
I have only one more question because I do have to teach in 10 minutes, but I'm only 2 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I have one more question, and this may seem controversial, but I'm wondering, should you monitor your child's friend groups if they're, because I do know it is a social contagion. And so I'm wondering, if it were up to you, would you ban um letting the kids dress in furry accessories in schools?
I think that's a hard one to answer,
Okay.
because I think that a natural there's a natural purpose or reason or desire or value, we'll say, to exploration at these ages, of wearing furry things or wearing different kinds of clothes. There's a value that that can provide for one's exploration of identity. But I think that it's a very delicate balance when one starts losing touch with reality. And I think when they start saying things like, I want to be called meow meow because I'm a cat, that's when the line has been crossed. And that's when the red flag should go up. I think that wearing furry things because I like the way they feel and furry things feel good and it makes me feel, comforted and warm and cozy or something. You got to look at the motivations behind why they're doing what they're doing. And I think it's okay to have some kind of feeling of wanting to explore different facets of your identity and what you enjoy wearing.
I
But when
guess,
that starts to surpass a certain point, that's when you have to take a step back and look at what's happening.
yeah, I guess the way that I feel about it is that school is for school. And so after school, if your family is fine with it and you've talked about it and you
Mm-hmm.
want to come over and
Sure.
play, that makes sense. But at school, that shouldn't be the focus. But that could be me being more strict than most. And
I could
so,
tell you, I'll tell you a quick, real thing before you go. We
yeah,
had a student when I was an intern therapist who it was a boy who was, I don't know if he was trans or just, I don't know, cross dresser or whatever we called them back in the day. And he was getting beat up on his way to school because he was wearing girls' clothes. And we actually had a conversation with the parents and said, your kid needs to wear that's for after school because your kid's not safe wearing that at school. So we actually, and it worked. He ended up, wearing just normal boy clothes and after school wore, girl clothes and ended up being fine. It was a way to protect him. And he was protected and then ended up being okay, at least for the time that we were working with him. So
yeah,
I don't think that's overly conservative either. I think it's a family case by case basis. I think that can work. I've suggested it as a therapist myself, and it
yeah.
ended up working for this family. So I
Okay.
think that that can be a reasonable request as well.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for having this conversation. I'm going to put it up and see if I get
Sure,
comments, and then I'll reach out to you again, and maybe we can do it
sure.
either earlier or on a day when I don't work.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it as always.
I so appreciate it. Love you forever.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Love you too. Take good care. Okay, have a good
Thanks.
rest of your day. Okay, bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye bye.